So we're ready to go. Welcome to this session on challenges to the global journalist. And we have three speakers. We're going to have more presentations rather than a back and forth discussion between me and them. And some very interesting perspectives. The first speaker will be Professor Berger, who is now Director of Freedom of Information and Media Development at UNESCO. And Guy will talk about why it's important for journalists to know about, for example, the Snowden effect at the United Nations. And he will mention a new, just come out UNESCO study relating to privacy and freedom of expression. And he'll also mention the upcoming International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists. So welcome, Guy.
Thank you, Ren.
He'll soon be with us. Guy will talk for 15 minutes, and then there will be 5 minutes for you to put specific questions to him, and we'll continue in that way.
Right. Thank you very much, Roland, who is an old colleague of mine, and I think 10, 15 years ago he told me that email is as private as a postcard, and it was proved true. I was going to speak particularly about what is happening in the United Nations on this question of privacy, which of course is a very big challenge for journalists. Because I'm from UNESCO, which is part of the United Nations, it has its own General Assembly of 195 countries. They come there. But it's not the only actor. There are many other actors in the UN that are tackling these complex issues. So this is really the thrust of what I'm going to do, is cover some of the interesting developments. And I will be surprised if you all are experts in this already, because perhaps it's a failing on the UN to communicate all these things. So, as Roland said, I'll look at the Snowden effect on the UN. And in fact, I'll go a bit earlier than that. The UNESCO study that we have to do, which relates to these issues, and some looking ahead. So, interestingly, the UN began to deal with these issues of privacy starting way back in 2009 already. And there's a special rapporteur for the UN to balance the anti-terrorism, national security initiatives with human rights. His name was Martin Scheinin. Now there's a new one, but in 2009 he made a report, and he said that countries should do this. They should have a law-based system, not an arbitrary system, and there should be independent oversight when it comes to surveillance. So that was quite interesting, 2009, that he already said that. Then you have another body in the UN called the UN Human Rights Committee, which is different to the UN Human Rights Council. Human Rights Committee is experts, and the Human Rights Council is the governments. Anyway, the Human Rights Committee is appointed by the Council, and it makes advice on fundamental rights. Anyway, 2011, again, before Snowden, they said these things. They said when they were analyzing privacy and freedom of expression, they said that, and I quote, states must respect that particular element of the right of freedom of expression which embraces limited journalistic privilege not to disclose information sources. So that's also quite interesting, that this emphasis recognizing that privacy is of particular importance to journalists. Then again, before you even came to Snowden, Frank LaRue, whose name I think might be familiar, he's the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression and Opinion. He came in early 2013, and he had a big report on all this stuff. And his report was called The Implications of Surveillance on Communications, especially with regard to privacy and freedom of opinion and expression. And this is what his report said. He said that states, when they're developing policies, should put human rights at the center, policies on surveillance. They must put freedom of expression and privacy at the heart of those policies. And then he went further and he said there must be laws Surveillance must only be exceptional, and it must be independently supervised. So these are very interesting points coming out even before the Snowden thing. He said there must be safeguards that make the surveillance proportionate in terms of why it's there, its scope, its duration, why it should be, on what grounds it can be ordered, who's competent to do it, and what kind of remedy is provided. And I think this is the last thing he said, is that journalists must rely on the privacy, security, and anonymity of their communications. And then he goes on to say that if you have surveillance that's widespread and unlimited, you cannot have the assumption or the presumption that sources will be protected. So if you really think this was all before Snowden, this is very interesting, almost prescient, of what should there come there. Okay, then after Snowden, you had a debate at the UN General Assembly called The Right to Privacy in the Digital Age, which was sponsored by Brazil and Germany. And what that debate produced was a resolution, and the resolution was quite powerful. It said that unlawful and arbitrary surveillance is highly intrusive and violates the rights to privacy and freedom of expression. All member states actually agreed this resolution. That same resolution said all member states of the UN should review their procedures and their laws, including particularly the mass surveillance aspect, interception and collection, in order to uphold the right to privacy. And it also said that the same review should see about setting up independent oversight mechanisms, so there can also be some transparency. Okay, then earlier this year, the Human Rights Council, which, as I said, not the same as the committee, but they related, the Human Rights Council, this is again, has member states, the governments are actually on there, it's not just experts, it's governments. They had a panel on the right to privacy in the digital age. They said they're deeply concerned about the impact of surveillance, including extraterritorial. That's the first time that point became mentioned. And they're also very concerned with the collection on a mass scale because of its impact on the exercise of human rights. And what they said is that the General Assembly had requested the Human Rights Council to make a report. And they said this report should identify the challenges and the best practices. So they should try and identify what is needed to actually review the laws and the systems and create the independent oversight. And they should say, where's the best, which countries are doing this the best? It'll be very interesting to see how many countries are even doing it, okay? I don't know at this stage, but we look forward to that report. Then I come to the organization in the UN I work for, which is UNESCO. So in November 2013, UNESCO also had a debate on this. This was proposed by Brazil. And Brazil said, we need an instrument to regulate privacy on an international basis. Now, by instrument, you can mean many different things. One thing is an instrument, the Security Council has an instrument. The Security Council will organize blue-helmeted troops to go and keep the peace. That's an instrument. So UNESCO has no military capacity or mandate, so that's not an instrument. You can have a convention on trade in stolen cultural goods, heritage, and so on. So you can have different conventions. They're quite strong. Or you can go through softer to have a declaration. So Brazil said they don't want a strong instrument, but they want an instrument. There was a big debate about this. Anyway, they came with a resolution. In that resolution, again, 195 governments, they agreed to this statement. They said, privacy is essential to protect journalistic sources, which enable a society to benefit from investigative journalism that can strengthen good governance and the rule of law, and that the privacy of these sources should not be subject to arbitrary or unlawful interference. So these were quite strong statements coming out of the UN. What they also said is that they won't have an instrument. They must make a study. This is often in the UN. If you cannot reach agreement, you postpone the issue and you say, we need to do more research. So I'm the secretariat. My bosses told me we must make a study of internet-related issues. So I'll just tell you a little bit on this. This study must investigate these 4 different components. And you can see why this happened, because in the beginning it was privacy. And some countries said, if we're going to look at something like privacy, we also need to look at freedom of expression, because that's also a big problem in the world. And other countries said, okay, we also need to look at access, because many of us don't even have access to the internet. And lastly, came a group of countries who said, we want to look at the ethics of all this, because it's not only a legal question, it's an ethical question. So anyway, we have to now study all these issues, although it started with the privacy issue. So this study, it must be a consultative study, and it must produce some options for what UNESCO should be doing on these 4 issues over here. So what position it should take, what programs it should have, and so on, and what its members should be doing. So we have to consult with all these groups, and that's one reason why my boss said I can come and speak here to tell you about the study, encourage you to give us your views. And we also, of interest, I'll mention this later at the end of the day, we're trying to think, you can study these things, but there is so much in each of them. How do we begin to bring a good methodological scoping and narrowing of the focus? And so we came with this concept of internet universality, which is not completely accepted by UNESCO, but I think it's on the way to being accepted, because it's based on probably 6 documents that UNESCO states have agreed at different times since 2003. And the idea is the internet should be universal. It should be for everybody. And if you want the internet to be universal, you need these 4 principles to be respected. If you have an internet that is human rights based, but is not accessible, it's not universal. If you have an internet that's accessible, but not respecting human rights, it's not the access to the universal internet. Openness should provide some open entry, open information, open knowledge, open education resources. There should not be monopolies and multi-stakeholders. So it's very easy to remember, ROAM. So using that, we came to define what we will look at. So now we have to look at privacy. So we'll say, what are the rights issues in privacy? How do you balance those with the freedom of expression issues, the national security issues? What are the open issues around privacy? So that relates now to the transparency side of things. What's the accessibility issues around privacy? What is the multi-stakeholder issue around privacy? For example, to what extent are privacy policies being decided by governments only, or do they do it in dialogue with corporations and civil society? So that's how we're using this perspective to analyze these things. This just gives you the very high-level overview. You can see, for example, freedom of expression. We'll look at some issues under the rights, some under the openness, some under accessibility, some under multi-stakeholder. And then we have to make these recommendations. So that's where UNESCO is at the moment. So let me begin to wind up and just, by way of ending off, ask you if anybody has got any ideas. Who said this? All countries have committed to protecting individual freedoms on paper, but in practice, too many break their pledge. Any guesses? Who said that? Nobody? George Bush? Anybody else? Okay, well, this was said by Ban Ki-moon. Okay, this is the man appointed by all these governments, and he's saying, you governments are saying things and you're not implementing them. And this, this is his statement. He says, when you curtail freedom, you're not preserving order, you're undermining it. And he goes on to say, Ban Ki-moon, on behalf of the international community, says, I'm concerned surveillance programs are becoming too aggressive. I understand that national security and criminal activity may justify some exceptional and narrowly tailored use of surveillance. But, says Ban Ki-moon, that is all the more reason to safeguard human rights and fundamental freedoms. Some argue that they need to curtail freedoms to preserve order. I say they need to protect freedom or they will undermine order. This is very strong stuff from the head of the UN. So I've given you what the whole UN is saying and doing and their perspectives on these. So what does the media say about what the UN is saying? Is the media covering the story, do you think? I see your head shaking. Well, I think the way forward is if the media want to do justice to the story, which is of central interest to the media, they need to make it a beat. Somebody should actually be monitoring this thing and saying to the public, our government has said this in New York, our government has said this in Geneva, our government has said this, Ban Ki-moon has said that, so the public should know that these things are being made. Now, there is an opportunity that I think is an interesting thing, that in November, December last year, the UN agreed on a day called the International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists, every 2nd of November. Now, there are different crimes against journalists. The worst is when journalists are killed, of course. That's the most, the absolute crime. But there's many other crimes, intimidation, etc., etc. Now, illegal espionage, is that a crime? If it's illegal, by definition, it's a crime. The Electronic Freedom Frontier Foundation, they have a slogan, illegal espionage is illegal. Anyway, so what is the legal status in any country? Then another question is, should the law be changed? Because, to what extent is this a gray area? To what extent is it an issue that is not even law governed? So this is an opportunity to raise these issues. So to conclude, I think that journalists especially, but everybody should know what's happening in your name at the UN. This study I mentioned, the Human Rights Council, it's going to come with a big study as which countries are reviewing their practices, which countries are good practices. Watch out for that. The UNESCO study, please send us your views if you have views on privacy, accessibility, and so on. And the last thing is we have that Impunity Day. So it's a time to raise something, say, where is the surveillance? Is it a crime? Is it not a crime? When is it legitimate or not legitimate? That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Guy. Now we'll have time for putting questions to Professor Berger.
How did governments respond to Ban Ki-moon's words?
Those Ban Ki-moon words were made in Estonia through a video message to a conference called Freedom Online Coalition, which is, I think, about 26 countries that made. Sweden is a member of those. So he made the statement, nobody would criticize Ban Ki-moon because they appointed him. I think the question is, does the public know about that? Are they telling their governments to follow these kinds of things or take cognizance of them? Obviously, governments are doing many things. It's what goes on the top of the agenda, and that relates to, is the media on the story? Is the public, is the civil society, are the companies concerned with these issues?
Questions?
Well, I hope I did not depress people. Because, in fact, you can see there's very, very valuable normative statements, values coming out of the UN system. The issue is implementing them. Imagine if there was bad stuff coming out. Imagine if the UN said, anything goes.
I don't widely read the Swedish media, so I'm not quite sure how much was reported of what Ban Ki-moon had to say. But I saw many of those snippets of quotes, actually, on Facebook. It's running around the internet, anyway. So thank you, Guy. So our next speaker is Anna Roxwell. She is a Swedish freelance journalist. And Anna's going to talk a bit more about some of her personal experiences working in Africa and elsewhere. She has a global focus to her work, and very much in sub-Saharan Africa and America. And she will also talk a bit about working in countries where journalists are not particularly welcome, and how she uses social media, Google, in her work, and the risk that where countries that have a limited technological infrastructure can easily fall off the radar, of the media radar. Welcome, Anna.
Thank you. Yeah, actually, I thought I will start off with the challenges actually today, because that has been the focus, and I felt that we have talked a lot about problems with being surveilled on the internet, but there is, I think Lena mentioned it earlier about a lost phone in Afghanistan, which is closer maybe to my problems that I meet. And I would say probably, as Ruba talked about earlier too, that maybe the problem is not that the government in many countries is actually snooping around in my computer. That might be too difficult. But the fact that I bring my computer can actually cause a lot of problems for me when I'm out working. I mean, sometimes here in Sweden people say that there is no problem for me with all this surveillance and all these things because I've got nothing to hide. Well, I do have something to hide. I have plenty to hide from people. I don't want people to look into my work completely. I have no intention of being transparent towards a state that doesn't want me in their country to investigate things. So I most certainly have something to hide. And as a journalist, you might want to investigate a person or a phenomenon where people have no interest in you going after them. So you will be Googled, you will be translated, they will read your articles, they will read the gossip about you if you've been one of those who stick out your neck now and then. They will read your blog, that is usually such a great marketing tool that can also be your fall when you approach someone. Yeah, pretty much they're going to do the same thing to you as you do to them before you approach someone. And you're packed with info. I mean, I can just when I think about what I usually bring, I've got my computer, my phone, and sometimes my tablet. Not to mention my phone book that is an actual phone book in case all of that falls into water or something and dies. And on my phone, I don't only have all my Word documents, I also have Skype history. I have emails from 2010 and onwards. I have text messages on my phone. I have the calls that I make the most. I have photos of my kids, and so on and so on. So basically, I've got my whole life in there. And the question is, you know, what happens if, let's say, I get arrested for because in many countries, I mean, that is very important to underline. In many countries, journalism is a crime still. I mean, it's very easy to talk about these universal values, but in many countries, you're actually not allowed to go after those in power to investigate what they're doing. So that can be used against you if you're not being careful. And I want to take an example because it could be considered an extreme example, but it happened to us, so I think it's fair to bring it up. I mean, I'm very close friend and colleague with two Swedish journalists that were arrested in a closed region in Ethiopia, and they were arrested together with a rebel group that is considered terrorists by the government. And the government had decided that it's time to set an example to stop journalists from going into this area, and made their court case a very, very big case and put them in prison for 438 days. And, I mean, they would have been convicted no matter what. That we can be sure of. But it was a little bit unnecessary to provide them with photos, emails, all these types of things that can be used against them in court, and then that can also be edited with some, you know, creative editing. You can also use their film material, etc., to make nice films where they are portrayed as drug addicts and terrorists. It's a bit unnecessary, to say the least. So, and also I have another example of when I previously was in Bulgaria writing about right-wing extremism. That time I worked differently, and I want to go into that, like how we have changed our way of working a little bit. Because when I go there, I don't want, in case I lose my phone, and in case someone has actually, of course I have a code lock on it, but in case someone has seen my code, which is not very difficult, I don't make sure that no one sees what I'm doing. In case I would lose it there, I don't want these guys who call themselves neo-Nazis to see pictures of my husband, for example, who is not Swedish. I don't want them to see my kids. I don't want them to see who I call the most, etc. I mean, those things are precautions that I need to take before I go in there. So, I mean, we can talk. We have talked a lot about that. This like surfing anonymously. You can definitely do that. You can encrypt your emails and so forth. But to me, I mean, number one is to make sure that you have a good encryption on your hard drive, so that a password is not enough, because it's very easy to extract a hard drive and then there it is. So you need some kind of encryption that makes sure that it's difficult even if you take it out of the computer. And you need code locks on everything, and on your phone there is an app that is called Find Your iPhone. And you can download that to all devices and make sure that if you lose your iPhone, your computer, or your tablet, or whatever, you can actually erase the hard drive from a distance. You can also ask your friends. You can make sure your friends have the codes, so that if you disappear and you don't hear from them for a couple of days, you know that it's time to press that button and make sure that there is no digital material for authorities or kidnappers or whatever. Also, phone numbers, we talked about that as well. We should never save phone numbers to our phones, under the right name, if it's someone who could be in danger, if they help us. Preferably not in the phone at all. They could be on a piece of paper that you can swallow, whatever, if you're in trouble, or on a memory stick or something that you can, drop in a hole in the ground if you come into that situation. And if you promise someone that that person is going to be anonymous, you don't, and I mean, we have done this before, and luckily not in the Ethiopian case, which I'm very happy about. But we have previously promised someone that that person is going to be anonymous in the picture, but you take their face because you're going to crop the picture later. That is also a big no-no, because if someone takes your computer, that anonymity is not there anymore. So if someone is promised not to show their face in the picture, you just don't take pictures of that person's face. And if you are in an unfriendly state, so to speak, I mean, it's maybe the best idea is not to phone people back and forth. Maybe it's a little bit better to send messages via Skype or WhatsApp or something like that instead, because that's a little bit more difficult to monitor. It's not safe, but it's I'm talking about not leaving lots of traces everywhere and being careless. And as someone said earlier, like, not have the same password to everything, because you can extract passwords from human beings in many different ways. And as you go, I mean, the best thing is actually to arrive with an empty hard drive. There's no need to bring your photos of your kids with you when you go out working, actually. I mean, you need the material for that particular job, but maybe not your whole life with you. But as you go, you also need to upload things either online or save on memory cards, and make sure that it's not all in one place. These are different ways to go around if you don't want to end up in a situation where these things can be used against you. And this is not rocket scientism. None of it really takes a lot of technological know-how. You don't need help from a techie friend either. Even, I mean, everyone can do this. But it's about, this is what I feel, it's all about understanding that this could happen. You need to, in every moment where you're going somewhere and where you're scheduling that interview, you need to consider, is there someone who doesn't want me to do this? Is there someone who could get hold of my things and use them in a way that they're not supposed to be used? In that case, yes, then it's time to erase everything on your phone before you go. You can save a copy on your computer, leave the computer at home, and bring an empty phone to that meeting, for example. You don't have to bring everything. I think this is something that we definitely can do, even because sometimes it feels impossible because technology is, as someone said, you don't have a PhD in computer science or whatever as a journalist, or maybe there is one person or so, but most of us don't. So these are things, at least, that we can do. I'm just going to see how much I've been speaking. I don't want to take up all the time. Yeah, and because from the beginning when I said I was going to come here, I had a question I wanted to raise, but it's not 100% linked to this. But those things that we find so amazing about the internet is that it's easy. Suddenly, it's easy to find people, right? It's we talked about the Middle East before. A lot of people are online. Suddenly, you can get cases. You can find people who are actually on Tahrir when things are happening. But it also creates a situation where there's a lot of people that you don't reach, and you didn't reach them before, but it also makes it a bit more difficult to write about these countries. There's less stopping you when a lot of people are online, and that could lead to a situation where people slip out of media spotlight. I'm not 100% sure that that is the case, because that has always been the case. So maybe we are just getting more voices. I'm not 100% sure, and I would like to hear what you guys think about that. Because as an example, I mean, before going to Bulgaria, it's not very difficult. We have all our sources and everyone ready for us when we come. But when we go to South Sudan and we want to interview farmers in a distant part of the country, definitely we're going to have to start working on that when we arrive. Or it's going to be much more difficult, at least. So usually that makes it much more difficult to write about farmers in South Sudan than it is to write about someone at the university in Sofia, for example. But on the other hand, you can find local journalists and people from that village where you want to interview the farmers pretty easily, because there's always one who went to university and who is online. So these are pros and cons, and I'm not 100% sure what I think about this yet. I just know that there places where I like to work, there are usually not that many journalists going there, and I'm thinking probably because it's difficult, it's expensive, and it's hard to find your cases, your sources, etc., compared to countries where it's all just, you know, you need a couple of tweets and then you have your cases. Yeah, so I would like to open up for a discussion about that, actually, because I don't have the answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, for that. Anyone want to ask some question? No? Make a comment? Nope. Okay. So we'll continue then with Dr. Peter Bergles, who's Associate Professor in Media and Communications here at Örebro, and has been involved with the Master of Global Journalism program since its beginning, and who's probably thought more about what global journalism is than anybody I know. He has written a book called Global Journalism, Theory and Practice, and Peter's going to talk about some of his insights and thinking in relation to that. The collective intelligence of the web and Google in relation to global journalism, the potential development of global journalism, and the continuous need for professional global journalists, despite Google et al. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you very much. So I'll give you a little bit of theory here. But I mean, the topic here is, the theme is challenges to the global journalist, or the global journalist in the digital age. But before I get into this topic, I would just like to mention a new research project here at Örebro University in our department about social media, which was discussed earlier. We have just started a project about cross-professional communication on Twitter, and particularly how journalists, politicians, and PR practitioners, how they tend to communicate in everyday work. And what we are going to study is whether this is good or bad from a democratic point of view. Because on the one hand, these professions tend to establish some kind of elite network. But on the other hand, this kind of communication is rather transparent, and it could be viewed by audiences. So I just wanted to mention this rather new project. Okay, challenges to the global journalist in the digital age. I will talk about two things. First, I would like to mention my view on global journalism, or the global journalist. What is actually a global journalist? I don't have an absolute answer to this. I mean, this is constantly discussed, and there are many different definitions, but I will try to give my view on this. And then second, I will try to connect this to today's main topic about internet surveillance and matters of transparency. Okay, so what's a global journalist? Is that actually, should one view global journalism as the opposite of local journalism? From my point of view, that's not necessarily the case. I would say that global journalism is the kind of journalism that tries to connect the local with the global, who tries to explain specific events or problems from a global perspective, where the local, the national, is also very important. In research, traditionally, global journalism has been associated with the sum of all journalism all over the world. It has more been like an umbrella concept in order to understand, what's journalism like in Europe, in Africa, in South America, Asia, and so forth. But I would like then to argue for a more practical definition. It is actually a practice which one can. It's possible to observe this in like climate reporting, when journalists deal with the climate issue, because the climate issue is not a local matter, it's not a national matter, it's a global matter. And not least it could be the internet surveillance and the digitalization of society itself is very much a global matter, which requires global journalism. I will also say that the kind of journalism that Anna does and Lena is also very good examples of global journalism, focusing on how the global problems, global conditions affect the nation state or the local community. So global journalism is not necessarily the same as foreign reporting, because foreign reporting is very much about, storytelling about an event in another country. Global journalism is more about connecting what goes on in another country, another part of the world, with the local. And from my point of view, this kind of journalism will be increasingly needed in the future, because it's the kind of journalism that we need in a globalizing world. Dealing with all kinds of interdependencies on how we are very much dependent on each other, ecologically, technologically, economically, and so forth. So how could one then connect this to internet surveillance and the internetization of society itself? Today, so far, we have very much discussed, the technological challenges that journalists face when they use technology in order to avoid surveillance. But I would then also like to add that what journalists today face is also like an epistemological challenge. How to actually portray, how to cover, how to make stories about this new kind of digital reality. So we have like, for journalists, they have like it's a technological challenge, but also an epistemological challenge. How to produce good, comprehensible, smart knowledge to a broader audience. And so how could then this kind of journalism actually exist in relation, in the digital world? I mean, this is very much also linked to, this discussion about the future of journalism. Do we actually need, there is this discussion about, do we really need journalism in the future? Because now we have social media, the internet, and so forth. This discussion very much reminds of a discussion that was held like 100 years ago. In the 1920s, there was this debate between two American academics, Walter Lippmann and John Dewey. And they discussed the development of the news press, which became more and more influential in the American societies in the 1920s. And Dewey and Lippmann, they were both skeptical. They had some critique. They were critical. They had some critique. They posed some critique. They were skeptical about the development of the news press in the US, but for two different reasons. John Dewey, he was very much afraid that the media and journalists, that they would become too influential in society. John Dewey rather viewed society as an ongoing conversation. And his idea was that media should take part of this conversation, but they should not dominate it. They should be one participant among many others. You can include arts, poetry, literature, music, ordinary people, citizens. They should all contribute with their ideas, their own kind of news and views on society. Walter Lippmann, on the other hand, he was very skeptical. I mean, to some extent, he agreed with Dewey. Yes, okay, society is an ongoing conversation. It is important with pluralism, with many voices. But it's also a problem, because citizens are in need. They need reliable information. They need relevant and reliable information. And therefore, journalism has an important role to play in society. They should also develop some kind of expertise knowledge. They should actually they should be able to deliver qualitative information to the people, the kind of information that others cannot do due to lack of knowledge or resources and so forth. Lippmann was very much then accused of elitism for this, because he somehow argued for the relevance of journalism as some kind of experts in society. And not least the fact that he very much also emphasized that journalists should be influenced by scientists. But if we transfer their debate to today's society, Dewey's way of reasoning could be linked to this idea about the internet as the collective intelligence. That the internet could be viewed it could be viewed as a space with numerous different voices, at least in democratic societies, and that this is enough. We don't need professional journalism. There is this collective intelligence out there, and it's up to us to pick, the kind of information that we find relevant or important. From a Lippmann, but this could be criticized from Lippmann's point of view, by saying that, okay, but we still need some professionals that help us to orient ourselves in this new digitalized society, which includes, global independencies, very complex kind of events, processes, big data, etc. And the Snowden case very much exemplified this, because Snowden, whistleblowers are essentially important and will also be very important in the future, but Snowden still needed journalists in order to reframe his information, the information that he got. This kind of big data still needs to be transformed into storytelling so it could be consumed by many people. So from that point of view, both Dew and Lippmann are right. Today's digitalized society needs both, it's both a matter of, working for pluralism, the existence of many different voices on the web, but on the other hand, we live in a very complex society which needs professional journalists who will cover this, who will actually help us to understand what goes on. So journalism is needed not despite of the web, but because of the web. And rather than, there is also this idea that now journalism has to change. Yeah, that might be true to some extent, but I also say that what is needed is what we can see this as like what is needed is like a rebirth of traditional journalism, but in a new context. Finally, I could say something. I could present some wild speculations about, the future of journalism and especially global journalism in this digital context. I still think that, journalism does change a lot in some technological respects when it comes to speed, for example. Definitely it has changed when it comes to, the ability to disseminate information extremely fast. But I still think that in the future, technology could be used in a more creative way, in a much more creative way than is the case so far. For example, there are discussions about hypertextual storytelling, How could one actually use this kind of hypertextual techniques to link different texts in a smart and comprehensible way? I think that we have not seen, we will see much more of that in the future. But also that journalism could use technology in order to develop a much more virtual kind of experience when presenting news, which could be linked to gaming, the aesthetics of gaming and so forth. So I think that there will be, in the future, there are many possibilities to develop journalism, not only when it comes to speed, but also when it comes to the very storytelling, the way you actually narrate and explain events to an audience. And hopefully in the future, the ability to connect local and global matters will become a much more of an everyday, a much more normal kind of routine among many journalists, not only like specialists, because simply that will be needed in a global world. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'm going to ask Professor directly, because he was the one who dreamt up this whole program of Master of Global Journalism. So I would like to hear from you, Stig. What do you think about what is global journalism or the challenges facing it?
To sum up or evaluate what has been said. Well, I couldn't. I definitely agree to a large extent to what have been said. I think the ideas, I was not the only one to dream up this, Roland. You were part of it, definitely, this global journalist program. But it has been developed by colleagues like Peter, in a very interesting way, a very productive way, I would say. I think there is a lot of, there is a huge challenge in this, what Peter is sort of asking for when it comes to the profession of journalism. We have the technology, to some extent perhaps also the epistemology. But it's still a huge problem in my view that journalism is so very much provincial or national in its focus, in its outlook. And coming over to the distinction between global journalism and foreign news, I think that captures, I think, a lot of the problem. Journalists like Anna and her friends and colleagues are doing a very important work, but I think in trying to report about the global conditions to local and national audiences, but also, of course, to multinational audiences. But I think it's typical that Anna and these people are mainly freelancers. They are not usually employed by the mainstream media houses or companies. And so I think there is an institutional problem that is linked to, and media organizations that are linked to this national focus or national or provincial outlook, which really has to be struggled with. And I mean, our dream was to make a small contribution in that direction. Recently, I've been working with my friend and colleague, Professor Rune Ottosson, about recent development, talking about the last 20 years or so, of international conflicts and war. And we have been struck by, when we analyzed, it's a book coming out later this year, I hope, when, for example, we studied the Libyan war and how that was reported in Swedish, Norwegian, and some other media, it was not only a problem that we saw repeated again from the Gulf War, the Kosovo War, and whatever, the national outlooks and views, but also, in particular when it comes to the Libya war, for example, the lack of coverage of the legal aspect, human rights aspect and legal aspects, customary law, or how Geneva Convention and so on was interpreted by the leading political actors. And the lack of coverage of critical reporting about that in the media. And also, which was even more sort of a problem, I would say, that journalists, the mainstream media, didn't even bother to go into the Security Council resolution that was used to legitimize this NATO intervention. Because if they had done, they would have realized that the resolution was used for something, usually called regime change, instead of used for what it was said to be meant for, to protect the civil population of Libya, civilians. So what I'm trying to say is that, in my view, there is a very strong need of having journalists the journalist profession developing their competence when it comes to international law and also in reporting about the UN organizations as such. So when Guy spoke here about the lack of coverage of the discussion and those steps forward in protecting journalism within UNESCO, I saw a direct parallel to what we saw in the Libya war. I mean, ignorance is probably the most positive interpretation of that. There could be worse words for calling the lack of coverage of how the resolution was used in that war when it comes to the warfare and what happened on the ground. And we see the consequences now, every day reported about the problems in Libya, which is just one consequence. Yeah, thank you. That was some reflections.
Thank you, Stig. Any other comments or questions to Peter or any of the other panelists?
May I add a question to Pete? What projects do you know of? Are there serious attempts to do something about this, what I would say is a lack of competence in the journalist profession internationally?
Actually, I should pass the microphone to Dean because he has a very interesting project and I think it's appropriate for him to address this. I certainly think that a lot more creativity is called for on the part of the institutions that traditionally have done public relations, putting out statements and so on. The question of social media, of capacitating journalists, of really trying to bring these issues to the public. It's a huge issue, and I think in some ways it's also possible to bypass the journalists, but as was said, you need that expertise in addition. But can I share the mic with Dean, who has a very interesting project in Geneva, at least?
Yes. So one of the projects that G Media is working with is very much related to what you're saying. We work mostly right now with developing countries, so journalists from developing countries, and we bring them to Geneva and provide training to them specifically on the Universal Periodic Review. So that's, for those that don't know, it's part of a review process that all the countries undergo from the other 195 countries that are within the UN. So we bring the journalists to Geneva, train them, get them access to become part of their country under review, and then hold their governments accountable by providing them excuse me, the tools and the connections to report back in their country. So it's a lot of work to do, a long ways to go, but it's trying to address exactly what you're mentioning.
One last question just behind you there.
I have a question for Peter. You said that international journalism is more about storytelling and that this is where the difference between international journalism and global journalism is. That global journalism is mostly about connecting the global to the local. And I was wondering, how do we connect the global to the local if not by storytelling? Is it mostly by building networks of professionals, communities, dedicated communities? And if it is so, how do we do this without storytelling?
It has to be done through storytelling. And that's what we also can, in our own research, we have observed this kind of journalism in, for example, climate change reporting. It's the kind of reporting where you cannot define it as local journalism, it's not foreign reporting, so it's something, it's a hybrid. And I mean, these kind of global journalistic reports, it's the same kind of, storytelling as in an ordinary local news report. But of course, if you want to do this kind of global journalism as a local reporter, it's a challenge, not least from an economic point of view. You cannot always afford to go to other countries and so forth. But on the other hand, there are other ways of doing this kind of reporting. For example, I think that in the future, the establishment of international journalistic networks will become even more important in collaborations. They already exist now, but probably different kinds of, international exchange of information is one way of doing global journalism in a at least more cheaper way, where you have some, reliable contacts around the world. And there are also in research, there are quite many examples of this. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, I have a question for Peter as well, because more than a question, is kind of like a point. The thing is that I see difficult to do global journalism if there aren't any global media. Because in the end, even though they're conglomerates and they are spread around the world, they have their base in a country or in a place. I mean, that's the point. And they report for the people who live there. So it's kind of difficult. If there aren't any global media, how can you do global journalism? And when Anna was saying, global journalists are more freelance because of the same issue.
The kind of examples of global journalism that we see in our research, we see it, we observe it in local reporting, in public service journalism, and so forth. So, at least from my point of view, global journalism does not presuppose or require global media. And global media very seldom produce global journalism. Global journalism is more, the kind of journalism that explains an event somewhere from a more global perspective. And that could happen in a local newspaper, in public service media, or in global media. But but that's my way of understanding this.
So a last comment from Anna. Oh, we're running over time, buddy.
I took permission from the next. So you can extend it.
Thank you.
Because I have multiple kinds of questions to everyone. The question is for the global media, global journalism, whatever it's supposed to be called. On the online, when audiences are going online, viewers, they like to cultivate somehow their imagination. They want to see infographics, they want to see pictures, and they want to see things online. And then also you have owners, which was also the question, the conglomerates. They don't think of media and journalism as something, as a social act. They think of it as a marketing tool. How many viewers do I have and how much money do I have? And the question is, how come you can be interested in going to areas like in Sudan or in Libya or everywhere around the world where you have actually people who are killed, and especially journalists, especially freelance journalists. And now they're sending one or two so they can cut also on the expenses of death and how many people are killed. So how can we fix something like this? Another question, what is global journalism when you have embedded journalists? Because you mentioned Libya, and we have also Iraq in 2003, and we had these kind of reportings which were embedded journalism. And I believe, I don't know, I'm not sure, but it's not kind of journalism that you're supposed to have because you're embedded with the troops. What do you think?
I don't know what to say, actually. There's good local journalism, there's bad local journalism, there's good global journalism, there's bad global journalism, and global journalism could look differently, and it works in different ways, probably in different countries, due to different reasons. The kind of research, our research is very much, focusing on how this develops in a Swedish context, but and also to some extent in British context. But of course, in other countries, probably global journalism is less relevant because you're occupied with domestic affairs. You have to focus on that. So probably the kind of journalism that I talk about is most likely to develop in a country with, not too much of internal problems. But it could be practiced everywhere.
But I have a thought about that I brought up last time I was here as well, because as a freelancer, I know exactly how difficult it is to sell in global journalism to an editor. You've got 3 lines. I mean, you send your email and that person is not going to read it. You're going to have to call them and ask them to stay on the phone while they open the email. And it has to have pretty pictures and it has to be quickly, maximum 3 sentences in order for them to say, oh, yeah, that might be interesting. If you have, like, oh, this is a global phenomenon that, you know, involves all countries in the world. Good night. So you have to hide the global journalism in a local context, pretty much. I mean, I love global journalism, and that's exactly how I want to write things, how I want to do my reporting. But I have to take a detour before I'm allowed to do global journalism. I have to make it very easy, very catchy, and then they say, sure, you can have 2 pages, and then I do the story that I want to do, and then I tell them that, sorry, it didn't really turn out exactly the way I said. So,
I mean, you are not supposed to sell your stories with my kind of academic jargon.
No, because that doesn't work. but it's a really good concept, and we should all strive for that. But you have to be sneaky in order to get it through.
Thank you very much, panel. We've run out of time very much here.